You're trying to get to grips with the big forces shaping our world, but, well, sometimes those really complex global issues feel like a massive tangle, right?
Hmm.
Well, today we're sort of handing you a thread to pull. We're diving deep into a truly transformative story, China's dramatic demographic evolution, looking especially at the long shadow cast by the one-child policy.
Yeah, and our mission here really is to boil down the key takeaways from a pretty detailed report on China's population changes.
Hmm.
We'll trace the policy's history, look at its profound consequences, both intend and maybe not so intended,
Right.
and put it all in a wider context.
Yeah.
Compare with India, see what it means for the U.S.
Exactly. And just to set the scene, it's crucial to remember that back in the mid 20th century, China's population was growing incredibly fast,
Seemed really booming.
which caused, well, understandable concern among the leadership, and that ultimately paved the way for the one child policy. Okay, so where do we start unpicking this huge demographic shift?
Well, to really get the context for the one-child policy, we have to go back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The report calls this the high fertility era. And the numbers, well, they really jump out at you.
How so?
Throughout the 50s and 60s, the total fertility rate, that's basically the average number of kids a woman would have, was floating around 6, sometimes even more.
6. That paints a picture of family size back then.
It really does. Peak was actually briefly over 7 right after the Great Leap Forward famine. But for a specific year, 1970, the TFR was about 6.1.
Okay, 6.1.
And all that high fertility meant massive population growth. Just between 1950 and 1970, China's population shot up by nearly 50%.
50% in 2 decades. That's huge. What was the thinking then? It seems so different from the later policies.
That's a key point. Initially, under Mao, a huge population was seen as a strength, national power. It fit with the Marxist view. So the official line was pro-natalist encouraged births.
So more people meant more power, essentially.
That was the idea. But, as numbers climbed, the pressure on resources started showing. There were some early sort of tentative discussions about family planning in the 50s,
Mm-hmm.
but then things like the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution,
Mm-hmm.
they basically disrupted everything. It wasn't really until the 70s that a more organized effort began.
Ah, right. The later, longer, fewer campaign. That rings a bell.
Exactly. Kicked off in 1973. This was a voluntary thing, encouraging later marriage, waiting longer between kids, and having fewer overall, aiming for maybe 2 per family.
And how did that go? Was it effective?
Surprisingly, yes. Very effective, actually. Through the 1970s, that TFR just plummeted, from about 6.1 down to around 2.7 births per woman.
Wow. Just through encouraging people, not forcing them.
Pretty much. It shows how much social change can impact demographics, something maybe overshadowed by what came next.
That's a massive drop in just 10 years.
It really is. And it means that even before the one-child policy hit, family sizes were already shrinking quite a bit because of this campaign. It kind of, well, laid the groundwork, maybe unintentionally, for the more drastic steps later.
Okay, so families were already getting smaller voluntarily, but the leadership still decided something much more drastic was needed. Why the shift to the actual one-child policy?
Well, in the late 70s, the thinking at the top really changed. Deng Xiaoping and others became convinced that continued population growth, even at that lower rate, would seriously hold back economic development. Quality of life, too.
Mm.
The big fear was China falling further behind developed countries if they couldn't get population growth under much tighter control.
So the main goal was economic catch-up.
That was a huge part of it, yeah. So the one-child policy rolls out nationally in 1980, a really sharp break from the voluntary approach before. It basically told most couples, with some exceptions we can talk about, just one child. Framed it drastic, yes, but temporary and necessary.
What were the specific worries driving such a radical move?
It was a mix of things. Real anxiety about feeding everyone, housing, schools, jobs. The population was pushing 1 billion by 79.
Right.
There was this fear of a demographic disaster, as they called it, if things kept going. And definitely a strong economic push, the idea that fewer people meant faster growth in income per person. Plus, the success of later, longer, fewer maybe made them think, well, stricter rules could work even faster.
It sounds incredibly top-down, almost like social engineering. How did they enforce it across such a huge country?
It was a multi-pronged strategy. Massive propaganda efforts. One family, one child was everywhere. Incentives for families who complied.
Okay.
But also significant punishments for those who didn't. Big fines. Losing your job or apartment for having an out-of-plan birth. And, yes, in some documented cases, much worse things like forced sterilizations and abortions.
That's pretty grim. It raises huge human rights questions.
Absolutely. And there was a lot of international criticism for exactly that reason. The government's defense at the time was basically, this is tough, but necessary. Look at our population pressures. Propaganda was constant, reinforcing the norm. And the state provided free birth control IUDs, and sterilizations were very common to try and ensure compliance.
But it wasn't strictly one child for everyone, was it? You mentioned exceptions.
Right. Good point.
Yeah.
It wasn't absolute. By the mid-'80s, for instance, lots of rural families could have a second child, especially if the first was a girl. And ethnic minorities usually had different rules, often allowed more children.
Okay.
But still, we're talking an estimated 35–40% of the population, mainly urban Han Chinese families, who were strictly held to one child for most of the policy's life. And it lasted over 3 decades.
30 years.
Yeah. The government claimed it prevented around 400 million births. That number is debated by demographers, but the scale of the impact, undeniable.
So after 3 decades of this incredibly strict policy, what led to it finally being eased and then scrapped altogether?
Well, by the 2010s, the chickens were coming home to roost, so to speak. The unintended consequences were becoming really clear and worrying the government, especially the rapidly aging society and the looming shrinkage of the workforce.
Right, the long-term effects kicking in.
Exactly. So they started relaxing things gradually. In 2013, they allowed couples to have 2 kids if either parent was an only child. Then, the big one, 2016, the one-child policy is officially over, replaced nationwide by a 2-child policy for everyone.
Okay.
And then, even more recently, 2021, they upped it again to 3 children per couple, basically ending strict birth quotas altogether.
That sounds like a complete U-turn. Did it work? Did births shoot up again?
Well, that was the hope, but no,
Whoa.
not really. The changes just didn't reverse the falling birth trend in any significant way. There was a small, very short-lived increase right after the 2-child policy came in, maybe 470,000 extra births the first year, far short of the 2 million they were forecasting. And by the late 2010s, early 2020s, birth rates just kept falling. It really shows how deep-seated the reasons for low fertility are now.
What are those main reasons then, if it's not just the policy anymore?
Oh, it's a whole bundle of things. The sheer cost of raising kids, especially in cities, people getting married later, having kids later, more women getting educated and pursuing careers, and just fundamental shifts in what people want from family life. The whole idea of needing a big family has changed. By 2020, the TFR was down to about 1.3. Way below replacement level.
And even lower since.
Reportedly, yeah, around 1.09 in 2021. That's among the lowest anywhere in the world. So the policy absolutely slashed birth rates, maybe too effectively in hindsight, and now China's dealing with these massive demographic challenges because of it.
So what are the biggest demographic consequences staring China in the face right now?
Well, the most obvious one is that dramatic fertility decline we just talked about. Going from over 6 births per woman down to nearly 1 has completely reshaped the population structure.
Right.
And that leads directly to the second big consequence, a rapidly aging population. Fewer babies replacing older generations, plus those big groups born before the policy are now getting old.
You see a real shift in the age balance.
Exactly. And it hit a kind of critical milestone in 2022, a historic moment, really. China's total population actually fell for the first time in decades.
Wow.
It peaked around 1.42 billion in 2021, and now it's shrinking. We haven't seen that since the big famine in the early 60s. UN projections suggest the decline could be huge, maybe over 100 million fewer people by 2050. Some dire scenarios even see it below 800 million by 2100.
Those numbers are mind-boggling. What indicators really show the impact of this aging and shrinking?
A key one is the dependency ratio, specifically how many working-age people there are for each retiree. In 2020, it was roughly 5 workers for every person over 65.
Okay, 5 to 1. Seems okay.
Well, it was, but it's projected to fall off a cliff. Estimates are by 2035, it'll be more like 2.4 workers per retiree, and by 2050, maybe only 1.6?
1.6 workers per retiree.
Think about that. The burden on each worker to support the elderly population basically triples in about 30 years. That's a huge strain for economists and policymakers to figure out. Where does the money come from?
That sounds like immense pressure on the whole system.
It is. And the old age dependency ratio tells the same story. By mid-century, maybe nearly half the population could be over 65, meaning only 2 workers for every senior. And the really crucial thing here is that this aging is happening fast and at a lower stage of economic development than, say, Japan or Germany when they aged.
Right. Japan got rich before it got old.
Exactly. China faces this big challenge, growing old before growing rich. Japan's ratio now is already about 2 workers per retiree, so you see where China is heading, but without Japan's accumulated wealth cushion.
The report also mentioned a significant gender imbalance. How does that fit in?
Yeah, that's another major consequence. The policy, plus that strong cultural preference for sons, led to sex-selective abortions, sometimes even infanticide, especially in the 80s and 90s. So by 2021, there were about 30 million more men than women. Estimates suggest maybe 62 million missing women over the decades due to these practices.
That's staggering.
It is. The birth ratio was heavily skewed towards boys for years, like 115 boys for every 100 girls in the 2000s. It's slowly balancing now, but it leaves this legacy of millions of men who might struggle to find partners. That has social stress implications.
Yeah.
But while the gender issue is serious, right now the most pressing demographic challenge is probably that age imbalance, the shrinking workforce versus the booming number of retirees.
So with this rapid aging now a definite reality, what are the biggest social and economic headaches China's facing?
Oh, the pressures are immense, hitting society and the economy from multiple angles. Think about the family structure first. We're seeing the rise of the 4-2-1 family.
421.
Yeah, one adult child trying to support 2 parents and 4 grandparents. It's becoming common, especially in cities, a direct result of decades of single-child families. It's a huge financial, emotional, and practical burden, a total shift in how families support each other.
That sounds incredibly stressful for that one person.
It absolutely is, and it feeds directly into massive strain on the pension system. You've got this enormous group, maybe 300 million people aged 50, 60 right now.
An entire U.S. population's worth.
Exactly, all set to retire in the next 10 years or so. Just as the working age pool is shrinking, many local pension funds are already running deficits. The Chinese Academy of Sciences warned the main fund could run out of money by 2035 if things don't change.
Wow.
That worker-to-retiree ratio dropping from 5.1 to maybe 2.1 by the 2030s, one Chinese demographer warned it could become a humanitarian catastrophe if the system collapses mid-century. So the government is planning to gradually raise retirement ages, which are pretty low currently.
Okay, pensions are under pressure.
Yeah.
What about healthcare and looking after the elderly?
That's the other critical pressure point.
Yeah.
Life expectancy's gone way up, around 77 now. Great news, of course, but it means more people living longer, often with chronic health issues. Healthcare demand is soaring. Spending has exploded. They need more geriatric care, more treatment for age-related diseases, more long-term care. Traditionally, families did a lot of this at home.
Right.
But with smaller families and young people moving to cities for work, that traditional system is breaking down. They desperately need more care facilities, more trained caregivers. The government's trying to expand services, but meeting the needs of, 300 million over 60s by 2035? It's a monumental task.
And how is all this changing those traditional family bonds and support networks?
Well, smaller families just concentrate the burden. That 4-2-1 structure we talked about.
Yeah.
It's tough. The report had an anecdote. A woman worried sick about her only daughter having to support 4 elderly people.
Yeah, no siblings to share the load.
Exactly. So you worry about elderly neglect or just crushing burdens on the younger generation. Filial piety, that traditional respect and care for elders, is being seriously tested. More seniors are living alone or in nursing homes now.
So the government is stepping in more.
They have to. They still urge families to uphold traditions, but they're also expanding state support systems. Developing social safety nets for the elderly is now a huge policy priority, purely because of this aging crisis caused by low fertility.
It sounds like a fundamental reshaping.
It is. The over 65s could be 30% of the population by 2040, up from about 14% just recently. It affects everything: housing, jobs, family life. China is facing similar aging challenges to developed countries, but again, at a lower income level and with this unique one-child family legacy layered on top.
Okay, we've covered the huge social challenges. Let's shift to the economy. What are the big implications for China's growth and development path?
When the demographic shifts are really starting to bite economically, for decades, China was in this amazing demographic sweet spot. A huge growing workforce, relatively few dependents, young or old. That's the famous demographic dividend.
Right, that fueled the boom.
Absolutely. It was a massive factor in that incredible growth, becoming the world's factory, hitting near 10% GDP growth year after year. High savings, lots of investment, young workers. Yeah. Perfect storm for industrial expansion.
But that dividend is basically spent now, isn't it?
Completely. The labor force has peaked. It's shrinking now. The working age group, 1564, started declining around 2014, and it's picking up speed.
Just in the last 3 years or so, the estimate is it dropped by maybe 38 million people.
Wow.
So the economy just can't rely on an endless supply of young workers anymore. This acts as a drag. First, labor force contraction means potential shortages, maybe higher wages, yes, but it erodes that old advantage in labor-intensive manufacturing.
So companies might move.
They might automate more
Yeah.
or, yeah, move production to places like Vietnam, Indonesia, or especially India, which we need to talk more about.
India definitely seems key here.
Yeah, because as China ages faster, India could scoop up that manufacturing dividend, attract investment that might have gone to China. That could really reshuffle global production and supply chains. Okay, shrinking workforce is one drag. What else?
Well, an old society can also mean weaker domestic demand. Middle-aged people are big spenders. But the generation coming up behind them, those now in their 20s, is much smaller because of the policy.
Fewer consumers down the line?
Fewer buyers for houses, cars, big stuff. That could hit sectors like real estate, which is already wobbly. Older households also spend differently, more on healthcare, less on consumer goods. So national spending priorities might shift. And fewer babies mean industries around kids, childcare, education contract. Some economists think a shrinking home market might make China even more reliant on exports.
And what about things like innovation, productivity? Does an aging workforce affect that?
That's a real concern, yeah.
Yeah.
An older workforce might, on average, be less dynamic, maybe slower to adapt to new tech, potentially less likely to drive radical innovation compared to a younger one. Fewer new people entering the workforce could also mean less competitive pressure, maybe shortages in cutting-edge fields. China's trying hard to counter this huge investments in automation, AI, high-end manufacturing, trying to boost productivity to avoid that middle-income trap.
But will it be enough?
That's the big question. If productivity gains don't outrun the workforce decline, GDP growth will slow down. Most forecasts see lower single-digit growth for China ahead, partly because of these demographics. So, yeah, demographics help China rise incredibly fast, but the next few decades look very different. Aging while still middle income. That could really hinder getting to advanced economy status. Some analysts doubt China will overtake the U.S. economically now, partly for this reason.
Let's dig into that India comparison more then. The report really stressed the contrast.
Absolutely. India is the other demographic giant, but its story is so different. Different policies, different stage of the transition. India officially became the world's most populous country in 2023, right? But the key is the age structure. Median age in India, around 28. In China, nearly 39. That's a massive difference.
Much younger population in India.
Way younger. Over 40% under 25 in India. Only about 7% are 65 plus. Compare that to China's 14% over 65. And India never had a one-child rule. Fertility has fallen, yes, but it's still hovering around replacement level on average.
So India is still growing.
Yeah, India's population is still growing, projected to peak around 1.7 billion maybe in the 2060s, then gradually decline. China, as we said, is already shrinking, and likely will keep shrinking unless fertility skyrockets, which seems unlikely.
Meaning India's workforce is growing while China's shrinks.
Exactly. India's working age population is set to hit over 1 billion by 2030. Its share of workers will peak around 69%, meaning a low dependency ratio. China's worker share peaked around 70% and is now falling.
That sounds like a huge potential advantage for India.
It could be. A young, growing workforce could fuel much higher growth if they can create the jobs and get the investment. There's a lot of optimism that India can follow China's path of industrialization, especially now with companies looking for China plus one strategies.
Right place, right time, perhaps.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Favorable demographics meeting global supply chain shifts. Some forecasts, like BlackRock's, see India becoming the third biggest economy very soon, maybe 2027, overtaking Japan and Germany, growing at maybe 6% a year.
But India has its own hurdles to clear, surely.
Oh, absolutely. Huge challenge. Youth unemployment is high. Big skills gaps. Uneven development across the country. They need massive, sustained investment in education, healthcare, job creation to actually cash in that demographic dividend. And fertility isn't uniform across India either. Some southern states are already aging, so the advantage isn't necessarily permanent or evenly spread. But for the next few decades, it's a stark contrast. China is hitting the aging decline wall now. India's in its youth boom. That gives India a potential economic and maybe geopolitical tailwind that China's losing.
And that strategic angle could be really significant in Asia.
Could be huge. A slower growing China with a shrinking workforce looks more vulnerable strategically. India, younger and growing, could gain more international weight, become a stronger voice. China might have to focus more inwards on managing its aging society.
Okay, let's broaden out to those geopolitical consequences then, especially thinking about the U.S.-China relationship. How do these population trends factor in?
Demographics are fundamental to long-term power balances. China's slowdown in aging are seen by many as serious strategic vulnerabilities, things that could hinder its rise relative to the U.S.
So the idea that China overtaking the U.S. is inevitable might be less certain.
Exactly. Growth is slowing, that double-digit era is over. Some doubt it will surpass the U.S. economically now, partly because of demographics. And an aging China faces huge fiscal pressures, pensions, healthcare that might limit spending on things like the military or big overseas projects like Belt and Road.
Whereas the U.S. situation is different. The report mentioned immigration.
Yeah, that's a key difference. The U.S. has much higher immigration levels, which helps offset its own low birth rates and keeps the working-age population more stable, even growing slowly. China has very little immigration, very homogeneous. So the U.S. working-age population will likely keep growing longer than China's. And the total U.S. population is still projected to increase, while China's shrinks. This suggests China's window to maybe catch up might be closing faster than people thought. It gives the U.S. a kind of demographic resilience.
But U.S. strategists aren't all relaxed about it.
No, definitely not. Some might see China's ominous demographics and feel less urgency, but others warn against complacency. China is still a huge, powerful country, but the rise of India also changes the equation.
As a counterbalance.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
A young, growing India is seen as a natural counterweight in Asia. The U.S. is clearly strengthening ties to the Quad, defense deals trying to leverage India's growing influence. India's democracy and its demographics make it an attractive partner for the U.S.
So a younger India offers things an aging China might struggle with.
In the long run, perhaps. Labor, innovation, maybe even military capacity. Now, India doesn't replace China overnight. China's economy is much bigger, more advanced technologically right now. But demography is a powerful underlying current that's shifting.
A different balance emerging.
Yeah. A China of maybe 1.4 billion and falling, share the stage with an India of 1.7 billion and still youthful. For the U.S., a strong India partnership looks like a key part of managing China's long-term influence.
And could China's internal demographic pressures affect how it acts globally?
That's another big question. Does it become more aggressive now while it feels strong to secure resources or advantages? Or does it turn more inward, focused on social welfare, more risk-averse?
Hard to predict.
Very. But slower economic growth almost certainly means fewer resources for grand strategic ambitions. Tough choices between, say, funding the military versus funding pensions. The U.S., with its relative demographic stability, might just be in a comparatively stronger position come the 2030s or 40s.
So wrapping it all up,
Demographics are absolutely core to the geopolitical game. The one-child policy might have seemed beneficial economically in the short term, but it's left China with huge long-term challenges. How China manages those will define its future and its rivalry with the U.S. And India's demographic rise adds a whole new dimension. How all these giants adapt will shape the 21st century.
this has been a really fascinating deep dive. I mean, the main takeaway seems crystal clear. China's huge demographic shift, kicked off by the one-child policy, is creating massive challenges now. It's reshaping China itself, but also the whole global picture.
Yeah, the long reach of that policy is really undeniable. The consequences, social, economic, geopolitical, are complex and will be playing out for decades.
It really makes you think about the ripple effects of big policy decisions, doesn't it? So, looking ahead with these huge demographic forces at play, what do you think the global balance of power looks like mid-century? Can things like innovation or policy tweaks really counteract such fundamental population shifts?
Those are the multi-trillion-dollar questions, aren't they? How demographics, technology, and politics all interact. That's what policymakers and analysts everywhere are trying to figure out right now. It's going to define the future world order.
Definitely gives us a lot to chew on. If you want to explore this more, we really encourage you to check out the sources behind this deep dive or look into more research on the demographic futures of China, India, and the U.S. Thanks for joining us.